Well, hello. I'm sure that you are all familiar with Maimonides' famous 13 principles of Judaism, 13 fundamental beliefs that all Jews must assimilate to their consciousness and accept. These were formulated originally in Arabic and not as a list of short statements, I believe such and such, but as a list of principles that are enunciated and discussed in 2 or 3 sentences, sometimes even 2 or 3 paragraphs or pages, done in Judeo-Arabic in Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah in the introduction to one of the chapters of the tractate Sanhedrin. Now, these are not the only beliefs that Maimonides labels as foundational or as the foundation, qaida in Arabic, or qawaid in the plural. There are other beliefs in his other that he labels as qaida, but they are not included in the 13. Now, what distinguishes the 13 above all is the fact that they are normative. That is to say, Maimonides says that anyone who does not accept the entire set, who has qualms about even one of them, has basically removed himself from the Jewish people. This is a type of a commitment that he doesn't request for the other principles that he lists as pillars. As you can see here in the citation from the end of the discussion and then of the presentation of the 13 foundations in the commentary to the Mishnah, you have on the right the Judeo-Arabic and on the left my English translation. He says that if all of these foundations are clearly established with a person and his belief in them is sound, then he belongs to Klal Yisrael, the Israelite collective. But if an individual finds fault with even one of these foundations, he has left the fold and denied a basic principle. He uses here the Hebrew phrases that are traditionally used to indicate that someone has rejected a fundamental belief of Judaism and basically left the collective. Yetzam min haklal kafar veikar. Now, in this presentation, I have 2 very modest goals. First, I want to catalog some, not all, but some of the beliefs and ideas that Maimonides and various other places marks as kawaid, as foundations. And then I want to also suggest why a given qaida that is listed outside of the 13 was not included and thus not made normative. Now, in fact, this second question, why were these other beliefs not made normative, is perhaps superfluous. Maybe, as they say in Talmudic discussions, kushya me correlata, because there's no real problem to begin with, because at least in my understanding, and I believe that I'm correct, the 13 normative beliefs were put together, enunciated, and stamped as mandatory by Maimonides in a certain historical situation that he found himself. He was living mostly in Spain and Morocco under the Almohad persecution. He himself had been forced to feign Islam, at least in public at some times. And there was an immense pressure to convert to Islam. And in the face of this pressure, I think that Maimonides found it necessary or helpful to formulate a set of beliefs that, if you accept these, you are still within Jewish people. And it's telling that the center point of the center piece of these 13, the beliefs that are found in the middle, I figure 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or whatever the numbers are not, I'm quoting them by heart, but the belief in prophecy and the uniqueness of Moses' prophecy and the eternity of the Torah and the rejection of any annulment of the Torah are specifically aimed to rebut Islamic claims, particularly the one about the Torah as we have it being the exact pristine text that was given to Moses at Sinai. Because in Islam, they recognize that the theophany at Sinai was a true historical event. Moses did receive a divine revelation, a tanzil, but they claim that the Jews have interfered, have falsified some things, changed things in the Torah, what they call in Arabic tahrif. So Maimonides makes it a mandatory Jewish belief that the Torah that we have now is the exact same Torah that was handed out at Sinai. And of course, the cherry on the top, if you want to put it, is the independent qaida, the independent principle of Judaism that rejects any possibility of the Torah being annulled in the future, what's called in Arabic naskh, and this is a distinctly Islamic doctrine, and it is actually a very rational and enticing claim when you read how it's formulated. And I think Maimonides saw their great danger, and so he made it a mandatory belief that the Torah as we have it now is exactly the Torah that was given to Moses, and it will never be annulled. Now, in order to, my claim is basically that a statement P, to say that a statement P or a belief P is a foundation of Judaism is quite different from saying that a statement P is the foundation of Judaism and it's normative. One must accept it. If someone of the authority of Maimonides says that a certain doctrine P is a foundation of Judaism, we should all have to think twice or three or five times before rejecting it. But still, when Maimonides says explicitly that anyone who doesn't accept it has removed himself from the Israelite collective, that's a different story. Now, in order to show that this distinction is valid, I would like to first call attention to a principle that is described as a qaida, as a foundation or pillar of Judaism, in the same text, the same introduction to Perek Chelik in the commentary on the Mishnah. So written under the same extenuating circumstances that Maimonides formulated the list of 13, and is not called normative. It's not made mandatory. In fact, quite the opposite. This is the principle of performing the commandments out of love, me'ava, without any thought of reward or recompense. This, Maimonides says, is a qaida al-i'tiqad al-hachamim, foundational belief of scholars. And it was actually goes back to the Mishnah in Avot, Antigonus of Socho, who tells us not to perform mitzvahs with the hope or with the expectation of getting a reward, which led, according to the Jewish historical narrative, to the heresy of the Tzaddukim and Baitusim, who interpreted this to mean, well, actually there is no reward. God doesn't reward and punish. Now, that's not the case, but this selfless worship of God is something that Maimonides felt was attainable only by a very, very few. And so, because one to stop any, to neutralize any threat of this Tzadduki heresy of people thinking, there is no reward and punishment, and also because it's something that you cannot expect more than one or two individuals in a generation to achieve, that it cannot be made normative. So it's a true principle, but there's no way that it can be made mandatory for all Jews to accept. Now, having said all this, the possibilities of Maimonides adding or discussing in later writings principles and that were not included in the list of the 13 can be explained, I think, most often in two ways. One, similar to what we saw in this forming commandments out of love, that these are principles that one simply cannot, for one reason or another, expect, let alone demand, of the general public to accept, or that Maimonides changed his mind. And with regard to the second option, Maimonides changed his mind, we have a case with regard to creation. In the 13 principles, Maimonides does not include the creation of the world. He doesn't say anything about whether, doesn't take any stance on the debate over creation or eternity, which was one of the major issues of the day, but he does not make belief in creation a mandatory. And I am of the opinion that he deeply regretted this and tried to rectify this later on. To begin with, as you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, this is Maimonides' own copy, his autographed copy in his handwriting of the commentary of the Mishnah. And it has here the first set of principles, including number 4, and before, which discusses only the sempiternity or timeliness of the deity. But in the margins, running up and down, you see from bottom to top, going sideways, we have 3 lines of text that Maimonides added later on, in which he added to this same, I think, 4th foundation, an additional belief, mainly that the world was created, muhdath, and calls this the greatest foundation of Moses' law. Now, in fact, this is really out of place here because this first set of foundations in the list of 13 all appertain to the deity. They qualify the deity in many ways, not being a body, being timeless, and so on. And in fact, they parallel the essential attributes of the kalam. Essential, I'm using in a double sense. The essential attributes that they qualify the essence of the deity. They're called in Arabic sifat dhatiyah, but they're also essential in the sense of being indispensable, that a robust theology cannot do without them. And Maimonides had lots of problems with attributes as they are articulated in thought or speech with a subject and a predicate, which leads to complexity in the deity, which is something we want to avoid. But he knew that a robust theology cannot do without them. And so he got around it by making these part of the basic beliefs and mandatory beliefs of the Jewish people as he formulated them. And he tags on here later on a belief in basically a scientific question that the world was created. He tags it on to one of these foundations that describe the deity. So he's changed his mind, and then in the guide, no less than 5 times, he calls creation a qaida. He calls creation a foundational belief, a foundation. There are other foundations that he may repeat once, but 5 times only for creation. To me, this is a painful cry on the part of Maimonides, trying to make up for his youthful neglect of this issue, I think, which was due to his enthusiasm for science. We tend not to pay attention too much to the fact that many young scientists plunge into the scientific enterprise full of enthusiasm and full of a belief that science can explain everything. Maimonides was one of these. In fact, in the commentary on the Mishnah, he says somewhere that science will soon achieve closure. In the Aristotelian terms in which Maimonides is thinking, closure of science means identifying the telos, the reason why for everything, the reason why each and every plant was created. This was created to make fibers out of which you can make clothes. This has some medicinal property. This is nutritious. Of course, now teleology is banned from science, though the scientists cannot avoid having it seep in. And but we won't go into that right now. But Maimonides says that there are only a few plants around that whose telos has not been identified. It will be achieved at some time. But as he matured, both as a scientist and as a philosopher and as a theologian, he realized that this is not so. He spent many hours on intractable problems in astronomy in particular, and saw that science cannot solve everything. Science cannot achieve an answer for everything. And he also saw how important the belief in creation was for the theology. And so he emphatically 5 times has it listed in the Guide of the Perplexed as a foundational belief. I'll read here only the first of the occurrences, where he says that creation is the foundation of the law of our master Moses, peace be upon him, and it is second only to the foundation of divine unity, tawhid. Don't let anything else come to your mind. And in fact, Maimonides elsewhere talks about having these beliefs come to mind. in part 2, chapter 23 of the guide, Maimonides says, for someone may someday lead you into vain imaginings through setting forth a doubt concerning the creation of the world and time, and you may be quick to let yourself to be deceived. Don't do that. I consider that to be autobiographical. He's actually, makeh al khayt. He's pounding his breast as a way of trying to atone for this youthful error. And 5 times in the guide he lists creation as a belief, and he put it back retroactively into the 13, making it a mandatory belief, a normative belief. Now, here is another doctrine or dogma, or that Maimonides lists as a qaida, as a fundamental belief, but it's not normative, and we'll see that there's a good reason. This is what Professor Penis calls the dictum of the philosophers, which is in Arabic, inul aql wal aql wal ma'qul. He is the intellect as well as the intellectually cognizing subject and the intellectually cognized object. Now, this is from Guide 168, where he calls this dictum one of the foundations of the law, a qaida, but he interprets it. He says it's a foundation when it is interpreted as he has interpreted in the Mishnah Torah. This is one of his few references to his popular work, so to speak, Mishnah Torah. And he says, I mean the fact that he is one only and that no other thing can be added to him. I mean to say that there's no eternal thing other than he. In fact, this is the meaning that he gives to this dictum in the commentary in the Mishnah. But he uses there not the word for intellect, but the word for knowledge, wal ilm, wal alim, wal ma'lum. And it's as a formula that he's taken from the Kalam, which is their way of getting around the technical difficulties of attributes, and having them all sort of like coalesce or unite in the Godhead. But in the Guide 168, after citing it and citing his interpretation given earlier, he imparts to it a meaning different than it had in his earlier writings. And this confounds what he has said in some chapters early on in the guide about negative theology, and that one cannot say anything positive about God, not qualify God in any way. And here in this chapter, he asserts, in effect, that the human intellect, when actualized, manifests the same threefold identity as God's. So this is pretty much a blatant contradiction to his proclaimed negative theology. And for this reason, this chapter has been the focus of a huge amount of research of the last generation. People are trying to figure out what's the point of this? What was he trying to get at? I have my own views on that, which I won't go into here. But the point is that a dictum that is open to two very different interpretations. Maimonides himself has made a sea change, moving from one to the other. And the second interpretation contradicts what he has said in the earlier chapters of the guide. Obviously, there's something that is much too complex to put in a catechism and say everyone must believe it. Of course, you can ask people to rattle it off. And if, belief, if emuna for you means just, rattling off, reciting mindlessly a list of doctrines, and you go ahead. But that, of course, is the last thing Maimonides had in mind. He wants people to think about these principles, think about these foundations, can understand what they mean, and then realize that they are true. So there's no way this could possibly be made normative. Now, the last 3 are all found in one chapter of the guide, Book 3, Chapter 17, Inaya, divine providence, divine God watching over us. The idea that humans have an unfettered capacity to do whatever humans are capable of doing. I mean, you can't say we're free to lift the Empire State Building with our pinky finger, because that's beyond human capacity. Just what human capacity is a different question, controversial. But the rule is that al-insan dhu istitara mutlaka, We have unfettered ability, capacity to do whatever humans can do, and that God does nothing unjust. God gives us each its due or due. Everyone gets what they deserve, or basically the idea of justice, adil. These are three very important theological concepts, and concepts where I think many people would almost automatically think to be foundational to Judaism and mandatory belief. But Maimonides, none of these terms figure in the 13 principles as enunciated by Maimonides in the original text in the commentary to the Mishnah. He does have two items: that God knows human actions and God meets out reward and punishment in line with our abiding or flouting God's commandments, which may seem to be sort of a popular distilling of these more sophisticated philosophical principles. We'll leave that at that. But anyway, these three terms are all also interconnected. Why do they all appear in the same chapter? Well, the chapter deals with inaya, with divine providence. But for Maimonides' basic position is that divine providence, the degree that to which God watches over each individual, depends on that individual's actualizing their potential, particularly their intellectual potential. And so he has to first establish that we have this capacity. There's nothing holding us back from actualizing our intellects, of developing to the maximum this Tselem Elohim, this wonderful gift given from God of intellectual rational thinking, and that God is just, so that in proportion to how much we develop our intellects and how much we bring into actuality, we will have a greater measure of divine providence. So they're all interconnected. But what's striking about this last foundation, in particular to me, is the fact that Maimonides emphasizes again and again that he's giving his own opinion. When speaking about fundamental beliefs, that he would say that this is a fundamental belief of Judaism by a consensus of scholars. And he does say this here in the first passage: I shall let you know what it has been literally stated in the books of our prophets, believed by the multitude of our scholars. But he also says that there's some of our latter-day scholars have a different opinion, and he will let us know what I myself believe about this. Then again, as for my own belief, and then the third one, according to me, as I consider the matter, and then finally grasp my opinion up to its last implications. So this leads me to wonder how much Maimonides is letting us his personal predilections, or his personal conclusions, his personal beliefs, intrude into what should be a set of beliefs that are meant for the entire collective of Israel, the entire Jewish people. Now, these are not normative. They're not made normative here, so one can say, well, you don't have to accept Maimonides. He asks us to grasp his opinion to the last implications, but not just necessarily to accept it. Perhaps it's sufficient just to believe broadly in divine providence. But going back to the original 13 fundamental principles, how much does his own opinion intrude into the 13 that he deems to be normative? Is his intent in the 13 to provide a list of basic doctrines that enjoy a consensus in addition, or does he wish to impose as well his own interpretation down to the fine details? Now let's take a look, for example, at one of the 13 principles, one of the 13 foundations in prophecy. One might think, at least up until recently, thought that the mandatory belief, the normative belief, is prophecy, that there is communication between God and at least some humans, that the chasm, the unimaginable chasm that separates humanity from the deity, can be traversed by divine communication to certain select individuals. And of course, Maimonides says that those who are meaning the word for heretics are those who believe in God, but simply don't believe that God communicates to humans. And so if you believe that God does communicate to humans, and there is such a thing as prophecy, where certain people receive communication from the divine, then you're okay. But Herbert Davidson seems to think differently, because Maimonides, in his 13 principles when discussing prophecy, lays out the whole mechanism of prophetic revelation as it was accepted by him and the Aristotelians of his day, where the prophet's intellect links up to this structure called the active intellect, and the message somehow traverses the barrier and reaches into the human mind, and then within the human mind it goes through intellect and imagination and so forth, until eventually it comes out as speech on the part of the prophet. And Davidson says, most startling is the obligation to know that the human species is capable of bringing forth prophets in a rabbinic venue, that is the commentary of the Mishnah, and with no apparent qualms, no hesitation. Well, this is only something that those who have studied philosophy can understand. No apparent qualms. Maimonides is mandating that every good Jew conceptualize prophecy as it was conceptualized by the Arabic Aristotelian school of philosophy. So according to Davidson, Maimonides has all of the details here as normative, as mandatory. And when we think throughout the 13, with some of which have fairly long explanations, Maimonides is requiring of us to accept the whole kit and caboodle, the whole text of the foundation, and not just the basic principle of prophecy or the Messiah and so on. So this is food for thought. When I first read this, I said, "What? This can't be serious. He can't say that it's a mandatory Jewish belief that there is an active intellect, and that." But as with often things that the late Professor Davidson said and wrote, after the initial shock, one starts to see that perhaps there's a point, and so we'll leave it at that. I'm hoping that you've got something out of this talk, and glad to hear your comments. Thank you very much for your attention.